I found, I think, a great center. A home is one way of putting it. That home does not provide me with happiness. It does not provide me with a sense of peace, but neither is that the goal, right? The goal is not to be comfortable. The goal is to find meaning and purpose, because in the inevitable situation where I'm going through pain again, now that difficulty and pain is reinterpreted as the necessary struggle that must be endured in order to achieve the values that I care about. And the pain that I experience at the moment is not the pain that is interpreted as suffering, but the pain of growth.
All right. Hey, man. So, this is going to be the beginning of a relatively long journey, I think. We are, hopefully, yeah. You introduced me to a lecture series that I really resonated with. I think it suits River Rock really, really well. It is kind of cutting at the core of what I really want to do. And so I thought we'd kind of talk about how, and you and I obviously have talked many times about these subjects, around these subjects. And so really cool to find a lecture series that, give grist for the mill, right? And just wanted to talk about, I'll let you start with kind of your process of how you've come to find the idea that meaning is perhaps the most important thing to explore in life, and what maybe you thought you were exploring before, because you've always been a very explorative person, and yet there's been this huge shift for you. So maybe I'll let you start there.
Yeah, sure. I think you have arrived at the importance of having meaning in your life much earlier than I did in my own life, right? Because you sort of built your medical practice, around that core philosophy. And even though, you have attempted many times to try to drag me into your perspective of meaning,
that's right.
As is always the case in our friendship of 15 years, I usually ignore what you have to say for a very long time. And then, I may or may not arrive at the same conclusion that you've arrived at, later on in time, and so even though I think we've both converged on the idea that, having a sense of purpose and meaning in your life is perhaps the most important thing that you should be working on, if you don't already have it, because it informs all your other actions and the way you conduct yourself in the world and the way you treat yourself and others. It sort of comes from that wellspring of meaning. I think you arrived at that conclusion, a lot earlier than I did. And my journey has been that, as you know, I was raised in a very religious environment, until the age 26. So all of my youth and early adulthood was in very Islamic environments. And then somewhere around the age, and I was also a practicing Muslim as well for the longest time, and around age 32 or so, I went over to the atheist side, right? And that was also, if you remember, the time when Sam Harris and, Christopher Hitchinson and the so-called New Age atheists, were in ascendant. A lot of those ideas were rising, I think, in ascendancy, and I sort of hitched on that bandwagon, and I said, well, yeah, all this God stuff is nonsense, and organized religions have a lot of problems that people do not acknowledge, and the sort of cookie cutter arguments about why God doesn't exist and why religions are all stupid, and like the Bible says that the world is 6,000 years old, and here we go, science says this is obviously not true, therefore the whole thing is false, right?
Yeah.
And I definitely bought that hook, line, and sinker. And while I still identify myself as an atheist, and I know you think I'm not, but I definitely don't believe in the kind of God that is defined by most traditional religions. I realized that over the years, that perspective of, everything is just, physics, which is ultimately where New Age atheism goes to, right? So if you believe that everything is just explainable by science, then, your phrase that you use a lot, then that means that you believe that everything is just a big bang playing itself out. In other words, everything is deterministic, essentially preordained by the Big Bang, and, because everything is causal, everything is essentially predetermined. There's no such thing as free will, and I think a lot of atheists, converge on that idea as well, and I think I did as well, and I still am a little bit. I still have a difficult time acknowledging that we do have free will. Like I have a difficult time explaining that in any kind of empirical way, right? Like I still think, empirically speaking, if you're completely intellectually honest, we have no empirical evidence that free will exists. So, with that perspective over the last decade, we won't get into that tangent, but what I'm getting at is that is at least my perspective.
Sure.
And that was my perspective for a decade, from age 32 to my current age, which is 42. And one of the things that I realized that I just kind of put a label to this morning, actually, as I was preparing to think about this discussion, is that what started creeping in was what I call a low-grade smoldering nihilism. So there's nihilism, which is just like this extreme existential realization that, well, nothing means anything, and nothing you do ultimately has any meaning or purpose. That's full right in your face nihilism. And then there's also the smoldering low-grade kind, which is not as well recognized, but it comes up in the way that we deal with struggle, which is that if you are struggling to do something, or if you are having difficulty in life, then any difficulty or pain that you experience is just torture, because it's not connected to any meaning or purpose, right? Basically, the forces of physics and math have converged to make your life miserable. And that's all the explanation you need for your suffering. And that is a very depressing realization, right? It's like, well, what can I do? And this, any pain I experience is ultimately meaningless. And if pain is meaningless, that is the definition of suffering, right? If you are truly suffering, then it's because you're experiencing pain that is arbitrary, and, by definition, if that afflicts you is explainable by just, empirical mechanics and the Big Bang playing itself out, it's meaningless, right? And, you're basically suffering.
And there is nothing you can do about it, because the idea of doing is gone. The idea of, if you don't have free will, you actually can't do anything about it. There is no, that's not a thing, right?
That's exactly right.
Nullified that entire concept of even fixing the problem, right? Yeah.
So over the last, I would say, a few years, and I've talked to you about this many times, and we're close friends for the audience, that we talk all the time. For the audience, to also be clear, I'm also a physician as well, and like you, very passionate about the profession, and very much identify with my identity as a physician. But over the last 5 years, have definitely felt that sense waning, and now in the last few years, I quit medicine for about a year, because I just was so dispirited by all the stuff that I was going through, all the difficulties that are inherent to medicine in the U.S. I quit, and I really did have a bit of a identity crisis and a sense of what am I even doing, and what does my life even mean, why am I doing any of this? Because everything is inherently meaningless. And it took a sort of a long walk around Jordan Peterson to Vervaeke for me to get a sort of structure in place in my own head.
A long walk around Jordan Peterson.
Structure in place to try to create a mental model in the world for myself. Where do I fit in, and how do I make sense of things, when I am suffering, when I don't like my job, when I feel the struggle I'm going through to take care of patients, or just to do my job, or just to live in the world, when that feels painful to me, and, pain is suffering, then how much suffering can I endure? This is terrible. My life sucks. And it was only once I started kind of internalizing some of Peterson's ideas that were, I think, even better explained by Vervaeke, that I found, I think, a great center, and a great sort of, a home is one way of putting it. That home does not provide me with happiness. It does not provide me with a sense of peace, but neither is that the goal, right? The goal is not to be comfortable. The goal is not to find some sort of tranquil peace or even happiness. The goal is to find meaning and purpose, because in the inevitable situation where I'm going through pain again or difficulty again, now that difficulty and pain is reinterpreted as the necessary struggle that must be endured in order to achieve the values that I care about. And the pain that I experience in the moment is not the pain that is interpreted as suffering, but the pain of growth. And that is such a huge sort of perspective shift for me that I think I think in the past I used to get melancholy a lot, right? And I've had this sort of perspective shift, as you well know, as I would call and complain to you about all the time. I would get melancholy a lot, and one of the things I realized the last 6 to 8 months is that doesn't happen anymore, because now when I feel tired or I feel upset about a situation, now it's sort of it plugs into the context of, well, this is what I'm doing with my life. And, the road is narrow right now in this journey that I'm on, and it'll be narrow again. And this is just a part of my life where things are a bit difficult and narrow. So any pain I experience is not suffering. It is actually building me up. And so it completely flips on its head the idea of, what do you do when you are going through a difficult time? Do you just think about it as, oh my God, my life is so terrible. Look at me, I'm a victim. Why doesn't the universe converge to, give me what I'm owed? Versus this is the pain of growth. And this is just what I have to go through in order to be able to live a life that is embodied by value and meaning and purpose. And so that is such a big perspective shift. And I think Vervaeke does a masterful job of, you've only started these lectures. I'm a little bit further along than you are, but I think by lecture 2, I recognize that, this guy is legitimate. I mean, this guy is a very special brain. And the fact that he's put all these lectures out for free, I mean, there's 50 hours worth of stuff here, and every video is very densely packed with very thought-provoking information. I think these, I've told you before off air as well that I think Vervaeke will probably surpass Peterson in terms of popularity and impact, because Peterson has gone down this whole anti-culture rabbit hole, where I think unfortunately most of his popularity now is polarizing, which is very unfortunate, right? Because he has some incredibly useful ideas when it comes to meaning and purpose that completely get lost when he starts railing against the woke culture idea that
Vervaeke's still got his kind of academic honesty in the sense of hey, let me talk about these things, right? Not some peripheral, but maybe culturally more firebrand kind of topic. So a couple things you said, and in our discussions have built even more about River Rock. And just overview, as I've been listening to, and as you said, I'm not that far in, but even just listening to the few lectures I have from Vervaeke, I am experiencing a certain jealousy of him that academics sometimes joke about, which is the jealousy that an engineer feels for a physicist.
I haven't heard that analogy.
Oh yeah, so this is whatever. Engineers famously are practical because they're trying to do something with the understanding they get of physics, what they study in engineering courses of physics, is not the most theoretical physics, right? It's not geared at setting them up to reinvent or discover physics. It's setting them up to use established physics, right? But there is a certain intellectual grandeur in being the one who is discovering at the forefront of physics, which other people will use, right? Rather than perhaps just implementing what other people have discovered. And so, yeah, in some ways, I do feel like River Rock is a bit of an engineering project more than... And I have my physics side. I think I am inventing a few things conceptually. But overall, I think it's implementing things that I've learned through a study of philosophy, and Vervaeke adds to that, and just my medical experience has kind of pushed me in a certain direction of what I think is nonsense in the wellness space, and what I think is, and how to do something that helps people that is not nonsense, right? So, you know, and that's kind of my thing, and that's overall where the channel is going, is that a large part of the current part of the channel is deconstructing current wellness ideas. Mm-hmm. The idea of just checking a bunch of labs and then optimizing, you know, whatever, Peter Attia or Ferris or Rogan or Huberman, and why that's a flawed idea. And then the next question is, well, okay, if that's a flawed idea, then what should I do to improve my life? What should I do to improve whatever I'm trying to improve? And the answer is pursuing meaning, right? That is kind of where the answer goes. And so then it becomes a mechanical question of, well, how do I do that? That seems like such a nebulous thing. And so exploring this topic is interesting because I think that the opportunity for me in the practice is to take these really up in the clouds intellectual ideas and create pretty reliable, ideally, algorithms of walking people toward meaning, right? And Vervaeke calls that shamanism, I think, in some sense, right? And that is kind of the idea, is a little bit more taking the difference is shamanism is an art fundamentally, and that's kind of that's kind of the stage I'm at with River Rock. But ultimately, what I'm aiming for is to algorithmize shamanism, so that I can teach this and build a new version of medicine, of healthcare, to say, hey, we need to be pushing people to live meaningful lives. And that is actually, all the other things will get optimized in passing. Right? And if we really understand how to do that, mechanically almost, as an engineering project, if we take the physics that Vervaeke is teaching, and then we create an engineering project on it, ideally, my dream is to be able to invent how we are pursuing wellness overall in this context. So that's kind of the first thing. I think you mentioned a couple other things I wanted to comment on. One was this idea of difficulty and facing difficulty. In one of our conversations, and Vervaeke talks about the value of analogy. I think that's a deep insight that is very useful in this process of sort of shamanistic movement or whatever. And one of the analogies we came up with in our conversation, I think, is one that I use a lot in my framing, my own mental framing with patients and with myself, is if you are standing somewhere, right, and you have nowhere that you intend to go, well, the only thing you can do is seek out the most immediate pleasure, the easiest path, right? And then the minute there's any kind of obstacle, there's a narrowing of the path, or there's some brambles in the way, or there's a branch, well, immediately you're like, well, I'll just go back and go a different way, right? Why would you push through anything? Why would you push through any difficulty at all? Because you're not going anywhere. It's only when you have a direction that you say, oh, well, I can climb over this, or I'll claw my way through the bramble, or I'll hack my way through with a machete, or whatever you have to do, because I need to go that way. I have a direction that I need to go in. And that framing frames all the activity of your life then in terms that are not purely pleasure, pain, ease, difficulty. Without meaning, that's all you're left with is am I in pain or am I in pleasure? Right? And, I used to tease you a lot where, one bad night's sleep threw you off completely into a nihilistic kind of, that smoldering nihilism, really rose up, right? Because then I'm suffering, I'm even uncomfortable in any way, being fatigued. And why? It's purposeless suffering, right? Whereas now, in your new job, as a teaching physician, you are fired up about giving up sleep, right? I know I'm going to wake up early and I'm going to go in, I'm going to teach the residents, I'm going to learn more, I'm going to develop lectures, right? And so you're willingly doing the thing that would throw you into a nihilistic slump, right? Because that difficulty has purpose now. That discomfort has purpose. And so it's interesting that idea of, you said it doesn't give you happiness. And that's an interesting idea. It doesn't give you a high. And I think we often frame happiness as sort of feeling high in some sense. But, and you said peace, and again, that's another word that I think we often use in certain ways. We view peace as kind of this static, still, sense of satisfaction or contentment, right? But I think many spiritual authors have pointed out that peace can be quite active, that peace can be a very dramatic, dynamic state where you are not merely sitting on the side of the river, but carried along in the rapids, and yet flowing with the current of life and directing it, deciding which way you're going within that current, and not all powerful, but not helpless either. And there's a middle ground there where you are headed a particular way, but accepting that life has difficulties, rapids, ups and downs, and nonetheless steering the boat. So, and there can be there can be a certain sense of peace there if you understand peace a little differently than the common cultural understanding of peace.
I think part of the problem is that while we have great words for things like happiness and peace, there's a certain sense that sort of descends on you when you're spending a day where you're totally ensconced and preoccupied with the set of activities that give your life meaning and purpose, right? And it could be a collection of things, right? You could, be eating healthy, going to the gym, and, taking care of your health, and, doing work in the world that feels important to you. And all of the collection of all of those activities results in a sort of emotional state of mind that we don't have a word for in English. And so we dance around what it means to feel that way because we just don't have a word for it, right? And when we say something like, well, this feeling is not happiness, it's not even contentment, and it's definitely not peace, but it is something, right? And we just don't have a word. I mean, I'm sure the Germans have some very long word for exactly what I'm saying, as they do for most
things. Or the Japanese have some
a
very short word for it.
Yeah, ikigai maybe comes closest, I guess. But I mean, even that's not, ikigai even is not the right word for it. But that's part of the problem as well, is that we don't have a word for it because we've lost the need for having that sense, right? And what I mean by that is, perhaps before we get into the lecture, there's some additional thoughts I have about setting up how we as a society, Western society, I guess you could say, found ourselves in this predicament where we had hundreds of thousands of years of prehistory that we are it's a complete black box for us, almost completely, right? So one of the things I like about Vervaeke is that he says, listen, I'm starting here in the history of man, right? He starts around the Paleolithic era. But he says, listen, I know that there's preamble to that too. I know that the story is
Sure.
much longer. Jung has also said, that our, memories go back a very distant age, right? We didn't just sprout
Sure.
out from the ground yesterday. And for most of that time, humans have had religious traditions, and sometimes those traditions became very well articulated and organized, and that's what we call organized religions of today. The Abrahamic religions are, I guess, very highly articulated, and there's a lot of ideas packed into them, some of which are taken literally, and that has sort of been our operating manual for like the last, say, 2,000-3,000 years, right? And there was an operating manual before that as well, no doubt. Then Vervaeke does get into sort of the axial age in the second or the third lecture about, some of the ideas there. But the point is that, around the time of the scientific revolution and the Renaissance era, right, which, I guess was the science basically started slaying every single truth or belief that, religious people had about where everything comes from and who's actually in charge and what are we doing here, and God created us in 6 days and then he wanted us to do these other things, and if we make sure that we don't masturbate and give to charity, then we'll go to this magical place later on, and if you don't, then you're going to go to this other place that's terrible. And science came along and started disproving a lot of these notions, right? So if the Bible says that the world is 6,000 years old and science proves that it's not, well, then if one thing is false, then, maybe everything else is false, right? And I think Neil deGrasse Tyson had this term for it, which he says God then ends up becoming a receding pocket of human ignorance. Is like, well, how do you explain an eclipse, right? That must be God. And well, then you explain it, and then suddenly it's a routine thing. And that entire process, I think, was well described by Nietzsche, right? He says, listen, we have killed God, and all of the water in all of the world is not going to wash away the blood, right? Because and he railed against Christianity for it as well. He said, well, this is your fault, right? You have completely perverted, whatever sort of cultural legacy you inherited, and the church is corrupt, and people are losing faith in it because there's this other thing called science now that's explaining everything, and your tradition is now spiritually bereft. And we're going to now find ourselves in this spiritual vacuum, something he very aptly called a God-shaped hole in human consciousness, right? And that entire story has played itself out just like he predicted. And while science has probably given, hope to a lot of people, we're definitely, I think, at an age where we are feeling the absence of traditions that used to give us meaning in the past, but which no longer can stand up to scientific discoveries or the empirical way of looking at the world, right? And then the question is, well, what do you put in its place? And that is, I think, one of the tasks that Vervaeke is trying to accomplish, and he's not telling you this is what you should believe. I think what he's doing is he's giving you tools this is how you think about the problem, and with these tools, go figure it out for yourself. What gives you meaning and purpose in life, right? So that's one of the things I really like about him, is that I think a little bit unlike Peterson. I think Peterson, is a little bit heavy-footed in his prescriptions, starting from, make your own bed and stuff. Whereas Vervaeke is like, listen, these are how these ideas have evolved, okay? And then these are perhaps the mark and goalpost ideas that you could perhaps utilize in understanding the problem, in understanding our tradition, and understanding the problem that the sort of Nietzschean has resulted from. And then, here are some tools that you might be able to use to try to overcome this problem, right? And whatever the answer to that problem is going to be an individual answer, which is a very challenging thing to do. This is work, right? Whereas in the past, you would just sort of have a religious tradition that you were born into, and well, that's just what you were born into, right?
Yep.
And now in a world of infinite choices, you have the paradox of, you have so much freedom that you are just lost in that freedom. You have no idea where to go. The possibilities are endless, and you are in an infinite expanse of endless possibilities. You could go in so many different directions that you're frozen by indecision, and you don't know where to go at all.
Yeah, I think you picked up two different threads there that many threads, but two that I'll respond to. One is, I think that's a perfect entry point into the first lecture, right? And the entry point I would say is this, is Vervaeke talks about, or one of the first things that struck me about his ideas was the idea of different kinds of knowing, and that our culture has become really obsessed with belief-based knowing. that knowledge itself is considered justified true belief, to quote the philosophical, epistemological idea of knowing. But he points out that obviously there are other kinds of knowing how to catch a baseball, knowing what it is like to be in love, knowing what it is like to taste a strawberry. Like, those are knowings, but they're not belief-based knowings. And because we subtly restricted the concept of knowing to belief, science therefore took over. We forgot about these other, and knowing what it is to live a good life is one of those things. Knowing what it is to be filled with a sense of meaning and purpose. So that's one thread. The other thread you mentioned was the idea of this infinite choice. And I think that is also a phenomenally interesting and challenging idea. We are a very freedom-obsessed culture, relatively more so. And to some degree, rightly so. I think we saw the abuses of the past that were created by external constraints like the church or, any religion in particular, or tyrannical governments, or so on and so forth. The insight that has not quite permeated from that, however, and you and I have talked about this at other times, is that freedom should be considered a coin to be spent. If you are adrift at sea, you are free to go anywhere. The moment you choose to go somewhere, you are no longer free to go to all the other places you could have gone.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Freedom is a coin to be spent. Yeah, that's very good.
And if you don't spend it, you may as well not have had it at all. Right? So if you live your whole life and die without having used your freedom to do something meaningful, why were you free? Right? Like, what was all that freedom for? Now, the interesting and challenging part is to discover that actually some of the principles that were contained in these older religions, traditions, that were previously sort of socially binding, were nonetheless good bases for developing a meaningful life. And so now you're faced with the idea that I have rebelled against the enforcement of those things, and now that I have the freedom to choose, I actually kind of need to choose those same things freely, right?
Well, I'd push back a little bit on that. So I am sympathetic to the view that, like in a lot of the ideas of organized religions, there was a tremendous amount of nonsense as well, right? Because it for one thing, resulted in centralization of power, where ideas of moral rectitude would come from a church, which had a certain hierarchy, or, in imams or whatever sort of religious order there was. And when ideas become centralized, then you basically have a central authority, which is essentially just humans telling you what to do. So the challenge is, which of the ideas in our religious historical traditions are no longer serving our purposes today, right? So I wouldn't say that we have to reinvent the wheel, and on doing so, we find the wheel looks exactly the same as the wheel of Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whichever.
It won't look exactly the same. And this is an important caveat, I think, speaking more socially. I think it's important to frame that it's very easy when you have a certain amount of intellectual gift to say, well, I want the freedom to interpret, right? Often people are not that's not what they want, right? They want to, how do I live a good life? And I don't really necessarily, often, not everybody has the ability to do this level of interpretation. Even some of the people that have the ability don't have the interest.
Or the time.
And so, or the
busy.
time, right? And so, I think you and I have talked about the idea that, religion gives you, at the very least, a basis that is, and frankly, is simple enough to appeal to a child. It's a child version of meaning, right? It's sort of like, hey, look, if you do bad, you'll get punished. If you do good, you'll get rewards. And here's the rules, right? Now, I don't think many adults view, brushing their teeth or doing their chores as still in the view that, I should get rewards or I'll be punished if I don't do, you know what I mean? Like that's no longer the mental model, hopefully, for most adults. And yet we understand more deeply the value of keeping a clean house or the value of, personal hygiene and Jordan Peterson, in some ways, I think is speaking to a broader audience more simply. Make your bed. Start there. Do something, right? I mean, it's no accident that Vervaeke does jiu-jitsu. He's a practitioner. Meaning is something we do in action, not just something we think about. We experience the doingness of it, right? There is a Japanese term, actually, that I'm quite fond of from the Book of Five Rings by Musashi, who is a famous samurai. I believe that, I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's Hyoshi. One of the translations I've read points out that the translation by non-martial artists is to translate it as rhythm or cadence. But martial artists understand that that's a very partial translation. It is, and he says there isn't a great exact translation, but it is something like, and I love this phrase, the texture of the sensation of doing something. Right? And it's a very evocative phrase, is that when you are doing something that captivates your full attention, you're in flow, what does it feel like to do that way? Right? And yes, there is a rhythm to it very often. There is a cadence, at least, to, I've worked on carpentry projects where you just get into a flow about the movement of the sander, or the movement of the, and there is a rhythmicity that develops, but the point is that feeling of what it is like, the knowing of what it is like to do that thing, right? The idea there is appealing to even the lower denominator of interest, time, energy, intellect, right? And then allowing those who have more to expand beyond and to engage with Vervaeke at a deeper level than just make your bed, right? But if I were giving instructions to the whole world, I wouldn't try to do this. I would say, make your bed. Start there, right? Start doing stuff. Yeah. So many people with anxiety want to think their way out of anxiety. And I'm like, look, go do jiu-jitsu for a year. Your anxiety will be much less, right? It's the action, but not everybody who has anxiety is ready to follow this lecture, even our commentary on this lecture. Not, it's just not within reach for everyone. And so I think religions appeal broadly to masses for these reasons. And then and we've noticed this, they call the Flynn effect, right? IQ keeps going up generation after generation. The modern IQ of 100, which is average, is far higher than the IQ 100 years ago. And so as people have gotten smarter, the proportion of people that are comfortable for their whole life with go make your bed is dropping. We have more and more people now who are smarter and smarter and more interested in, wait a minute, I need a more nuanced idea of what the rules are and who made these rules anyway and why are they the rules, right? And I think, again, differentiating that, it's not these are the rules because God said so. That's an authoritative parent-child kind of answer to this question. But more like it is the structure of the nature of human unconsciousness that makes this the rule, right? This is sort of the way humans interface with the universe best. That's a much more difficult concept to quite bite into.
Yeah, I've had a more empirical answer to and I think we discussed this in our own private conversations in the past, which is if you were to ultimately try to figure out why is it that, religions came up with whatever rules they were, whether the Ten Commandments or, the Abrahamic sort of ethics or anything else, I think one of the ideas I had was, well, maybe the rules were in such a way to provide an evolutionary advantage, right? So that societies run, social norm experiments, and the societies that survive and thrive and continue onwards to the future sort of pass on their cultural wisdom and legacy to successive generations, saying, listen, we've tried a bunch of things. This, helps the tribe survive. Don't cheat on your spouse and, have kids and, give to charity and, don't follow the golden rule. If you do these things, generally speaking, the tribe will not break down and we will have another generation to succeed us. But that might be where you can sneak in empiricism to the idea that you do need to have some norms for society, of course. It does not really address the notion of like, well, where in that context does personal meaning come from, right? In the modern age, right, where we're not concerned about tribes and surviving, because I might go hungry or society might break down. It becomes a challenge then to try to figure out in a modern world where a lot of problems have been solved that ancestors used to worry about, like 100,000 years ago. A lot of problems have been solved, whether that be disease or eyesight is going or cancer or any of those things. In the new cultural milieu that science gave birth to, how do you in this milieu come up with the new operating code, right? How do you update the legacy software in a way that makes sense? And
sure,
that perhaps draws on ancient wisdom, right?
Yeah.
But also introduces something new. It's the introduction of the something new that I think is most challenging.
This is bid'ah. No, I do think that there is a need and a danger both in that idea, because these things evolved over time. And as you said, if even if we speculate that social experiments were run, some societies died out who got the ideas wrong. Their ideas have not been passed down, right? There's nothing to say that this brand new, brilliant idea you think you have wasn't one of those ideas, right? That's already been played out, right? And so how you experiment is actually also important. You can't just decide. I think we talk about the narrative fallacy a lot in medicine, but this is another version, is that, well, I understand so well how society and humans are put together that I can see exactly what needs to be fixed, and then, we'll derive the perfect society from there, right?
I think they tried that in communism once upon a time.
Yeah, no, exactly. All utopian attempts are that, is you saying, I think I understand this perfectly, right? And I think in a lot of ways, to the degree that democracy is a better option, it's because it's an admission of not knowing. It's like, well, whatever. We have to keep voting on what we think ongoingly, right? And whatever we decided before can be undone. There's a process for that. And maintaining some thread of continuity, but also allowing for experimentation, updating, failure, reversal, etc. Right? Rather than a top-down, we know best of any kind. Right? And so, just pulling on your previous thread, though, too, that these ideas of charity and whatever, Peterson talks about how, and he's quoting someone else whose name I forget, the chimpanzee expert who studied tribes of chimpanzees. But it has been noted, let us say, without specifying who noted it, that it's not always the strongest chimpanzee who ends up, physically strongest chimpanzee who ends up as the alpha, right? Sometimes, but often those reigns are short-lived, is that if it's based on physical domination and fear and brute strength, 4 monkeys gang up on him, or apes, rather, gang up on him and tear him limb from limb, and then that's the end of his alphahood, right? The ones that are more long-lasting and often is not the biggest is the one who is the most reciprocal. The one who takes care of the women, takes care of the children, follows through. And so Ursula K. Le Guin pointed out that she had 2 characters in one of her fictional novels arguing, and one said, it's survival of the fittest. And he goes, exactly. And in a social species, the fittest is the most ethical. That's the most social is the most ethical is the fittest. That is the definition of fitness for a social species. And that, I think, always struck me, is that this is why these things appear more universal than we would expect, right? That similar principles arise in any long-lasting society or ethic just because that's the nature of a social species, is it requires, at the very least, some base formation of, and he gets into this in terms of the trader societies and so on and so forth, is you need a way to figure out, how am I going to trust you? Trade at some level requires some level of trust. So it could be pretty thin at first, but after a while, the amount of effort needed to maintain point of the sword trading is wasted effort, right? So again, figuring out these ideas of how to trust people, what to look for, how to build a reputation of trustworthiness means that other people can trade with you more easily, which means you have an advantage, right? And so pretty quickly you derive a survival advantage from ethics. Now, the specific ethics beyond reciprocity, generosity to some degree, not being, finding a balance between reciprocity and overly tit for tat, right? These are all questions that religions, ethicists wrestle with. How do you find these balances? But the idea that there is a balance to be struck for survival advantage, I think, is pretty clear. And this ties right back into the idea, well, it is actually then to my advantage to limit my own freedom by choice to a code, right? Is that rather than being able to do whatever the hell I want at any time, if I follow a code, I become very predictable to other people. I become trustworthy. And that actually confers a survival advantage because other people will more willingly interface with me and will promote me to a position of leadership, right? So, so just following that thread all the way through, once you have that idea of trust, well, hey, you're smarter than most people, and you're very trustworthy, ethical. Well, I don't have the means or time or energy or intellect to do all of these things. So I will willingly choose to just follow you because you've been gifted in certain ways, and then you use those gifts in ways that are ethical and trustworthy. So again, you start centralizing. And that impulse towards centralization is exactly that. I mean, it was an entrepreneur's lecture, but somebody pointed out that most people don't remember how they learned something or how much they trusted. They just find people they trust and take what they say. They don't keep track of the original derivation of every bit of information they get. Right? They just say, well, Atif said it, so I'll believe it. And then they forget even that Atif said it. It just becomes, I believe it.
Yeah. Getting into some of the specifics of the lecture a little bit, one of the things I'm curious to hear your perspective on is his emphasis in the first lecture about the importance of altering our states of consciousness. I am particularly eager to hear your to that, given how highly resistant you are to changing your own consciousness in any sort of pharmotherapeutic way, or even ritualistic way, I would think. So what is your take on the importance?
No, actually, you're mistaken on that. I do alter my conscious ritualistically. I mean, you can take very mild versions of this, right? Like, if you really zone into music that hits the mood that you're trying to bring up from your unconscious, right? And so, or poetry, right? Or any of the arts, really. I mean, the experience of art often was bubbling up from someone's unconscious, or collective unconscious, as Jung would say, right? So if that's what's inside of me that's trying to bubble up, exposure to that art will bring it forth, right? And so by maintaining a fairly wide sense memory of different art that I've encountered, I'm able to sort of recite those poems to myself, or sing those songs, or listen to those songs, or look at those sculptures, or whatever it is. And there is a ritualistic, altered consciousness where I really dive into that emotion and experience it fully, if that's what was trying to bubble up, and then explore why, and explore what that might mean for the future. I don't know. I am fascinated and intrigued by the idea of psychedelics. I think they can be very valuable. And I guess this is kind of maybe an answer to your question. I don't view them as playtime. It's serious business.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I would want to know why I was doing it. What question am I trying to answer, even if it ends up not being the right question? But I would need purpose. I would need to be looking for meaning I don't have, right? And currently I have not struggled enough. I have not perceived a dearth of meaning in my life sufficient to warrant needing to upend it or explore, right? So that's the...
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think definitely, psychedelics should be considered a form of, honestly, they should not be used recreationally as like, I'm just going to trip for tripping sakes.
Sure.
But, they potentially can be a medication. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of, evidence in its efficacy for PTSD and depression, right? Which,
absolutely,
not really sure. We don't really understand how that works. But I personally, I think, benefited quite a bit from, my use of psychedelics in the past as well, and I feel like I'm an advocate for their use. And
I've recommended them to patients. I mean, who are struggling with overcoming a sense of meaninglessness. You mentioned depression. It's interesting. We talk about analogies, and this is another one that I came across somewhat recently, just a few months ago. And it's apparently the predominant model in psychotherapy circles now of depression, which is a learned helplessness model. And the example that I was given, I think, is quite evocative, is if you put a rat in a metal cage, right? It's doing its rat things. You electrify half the cage. It'll start hopping around because it's getting shocked until it lands on the unelectrified half. And then it's like, oh, okay, cool, on this half, I'm whatever. And it goes about its business. you set up a warning signal so that there's a red light that comes on 2 seconds before you electrify the cage. It'll hop over to the non-electrified side, go about its business. It's a perfectly happy, well-adjusted rat. If you then electrify the whole cage, it will start hopping and hopping and hopping and hopping, trying to find a way out, but there is no way out. And at some point, it huddles itself into a corner and just takes it and stops hopping, right? The problem is if you go back to the original setup where you're only electrifying half the cage, the rat will never figure that out on its own because it has learned that it is unable to affect a solution anymore, right? Whereas it could now, you've gone back to half and half, it could hop over to the non-electrified side, but it'll just huddle and take it. That's what it's learned, is that it is helpless, right? And so psychedelics, I think, in some very interesting way, that is very much a loss of meaning. Meaning means I have a direction and I can go there. I'm headed somewhere. My actions matter in some way, right? If you come to believe that you cannot get where you want to go, you're left again with meaninglessness, right? And so I think finding meaning and then finding and frankly, I think this gets exactly right back to where we started in terms of free will and those kinds of things. It requires a certain amount of religious, fanatic, blind faith in the notion of your own efficacy. Is that even in the face of failure, repeated failure, I will continue hopping. I won't be that rat that just sits and takes it. I will continue attempting and failing, but attempting to find a way out, right? Because I'm driven by this sense of meaning and a unreasonable, unempiric belief in my own efficacy. And I think psychedelics can help with both of those things by unknown means. But the mystic element, I think, that more real than real sense, I think helps people to build unempiric beliefs that nonetheless are more efficacious, right? Believing in free will is just a better way to live than not believing in it.
You're right. Yeah, that's exactly right. A large part of our conversation today doesn't necessarily map one-to-one with the context of the first lecture, and part of that is because he's also setting up the series of lectures. I mean, there's
correct
another 49 hours to go. So I think it's, good that we're also spending some time describing the reason why we feel this is such an important problem, right? So he gets into that. I think most of the half of the first lecture, and then he gets into shamanism for a little bit. But really, the meat and potatoes starts in lecture 2. So in the spirit of... Go ahead, what are you going to add?
I did want to comment on a couple of things that stood out even in the first lecture. Moving on to the lecture, I guess, there were a couple of distinctions he made that I thought were really interesting because I have talked to patients who have experienced some of these things. So he described a sense of horror that is associated with finding the world meaningless. And it for whatever reason, if you find yourself in a meaningless situation, in a truly with a loss of meaning, you experience, it seems, a decreased ability to have a grip on reality. Like derealization. You start to perceive yourself and the world as being a bit unreal. It's sort of the opposite of a psychedelic experience in some sense, right? Where you start to have a distance from your own sense of existence, right? And that there is a deep terror and a horror in that experience. And I've talked with people recently who are experiencing that sense of derealization. And the awful sense that comes with it the terror, day in and day out, of not having a grip on reality. And it really has been, as I've worked with some of the patients that have had this, it really is about building your sense of efficacy. That horror comes from being imagine being in the driver's seat and perceiving that you're not in control. And everyone's looking to you to steer the car. And you've convinced yourself that the brakes and steering and accelerator don't work. They're all disconnected from the workings of the car. There's a deep horror in that. Is I'm in the driver's seat and yet I'm not driving. I'm being carried along, right? By sort of it becomes very existential, right? It becomes sort of the sense that time is pushing me unwillingly along on this roller coaster, and I'm sort of that nihilistic Big Bang playing itself, like I'm just being carried along. And I'm experiencing whatever is thrown at me. And so regaining the idea that you are steering a boat in a current, and just because the current pushes you doesn't mean that that's destiny. It's a mix of control and not control. It's not a car. It's more like a boat in a current, right? Mm-hmm. That finding the points where you do have control and becoming responsible for that is the way out of a way to reconnect, I think. And Vervaeke talks about that as the distinction between foolishness and wisdom. And I thought that was, his definition of wisdom is the ability to realize meaning. And he deliberately says that realize is used in two different ways. Realize is both to become aware of and to make real, right? And I would say even that second one is probably, to me, more primary, is the idea that wisdom is the idea that, no, you are steering the boat. And yes, there are rapids. Yes, there are, rocks you can hit. Yes, you're not fully in control, but nor are you wholly impotent, right? And you are responsible for the safety of your boat. So within the constraints of the current pushing you in different directions, you're responsible for steering as best as you can. And you have efficacy in some way, right? It's not godlike efficacy. You can't just snap your fingers and have whatever world you want, right? And I think that is sort of speaks to the victim mindset we were talking about, where the perception that I'm being pushed by external forces, if I don't have godlike control, I must not have any control, right? I think that you take every bit of external input into your life. Oh, somebody hit me on the highway, and now I have expenses that I didn't anticipate, and now I have, whatever, an injury or whatever. Those are out of your control on some level, right? But you have other things. That doesn't mean you are wholly out of control and just purely a victim of circumstance, right? And so attaching to meaning and being responsible for making your meaning manifest and real in the world is sort of wisdom, I think. I think that was a really cool distinction he drew. And foolishness is the denial of that connection. The idea, the derealization of meaning, the deflation of meaning, or the idea that anything matters. That nihilistic impulse is what I think he calls foolishness.
Yeah, he doesn't actually talk about this in the first lecture. I'm not sure if it's going to come up in the other lectures as well, but as someone who I think maybe still identifies, I'm talking about myself now, identifies as a empirical atheist.
Sure.
One of the things I want to point out is that none of this makes any sense at all if you don't take a leap of faith and believe in free will, right? And I think
Yes.
I talked to you about this months ago as well, as I said, listen, this entire meaning and purpose stuff makes a lot of sense to me. And I realize that, if it's going to actually be beneficial in my life, I'm going to have to take a leap of faith on something, right? Where I believe in something that I don't have any firm evidence for. And one of those things, I mean, and I also like pointed out that I only have to do it once, right? And the one leap of faith that I've decided to take in is that I have agency and I have free will, that I am, able to effect the choices that I make, and they're not just, mechanistically made for me. And, for anyone who's listening who has spent a lot of time as an empirical atheist, I would just say, carry on. But this is the one thing you're going to have to give up, right? That if you're living a life where you don't feel like you actually have agency and free will, I just don't know that it's possible to get from that state to a state where you have a life that's imbued with meaning and purpose, or in a way that's sustainable, right? Maybe you might engage in some project for a number of years that keeps you distracted and engaged. But I think even if you fool yourself into thinking that you're engaged in something that's purposeful and meaningful, and you still don't believe in free will, I think you will still suffer from the low-grade smoldering nihilism that I brought up, earlier in the conversation. Even if you don't realize that you do, right? It can still subconsciously affect you. Every time you get a cold or you break your leg or some misfortune befalls you, that mechanistic part of you is going to come up again and say, well, woe is me, why is the universe being so unkind? Can't it see I'm trying to do good in the world, right? And it just makes you much less resilient as a result, right? Because then obstacles are instruments of torture and not instruments of transformation. So that's the one thing that I think I would say, and admit up front that had been a shift that I had to make, and I will also say furthermore that that's the only one I felt I needed to make. That's
I don't think you end up, the consequences of that one are sufficiently profound. You derive a whole lot of things out of that, right? From there to moral responsibility to whatever. Everything, I would agree almost. I think that despite explicitly identifying as a theist, my one real element of faith is free will. I think somebody could convince me with enough evidence of a lot of other religious truths. They could say, hey, you could present me with evidence that would say, okay, hey, maybe this isn't true or that isn't true or whatever. But yeah, the one real element of rabid faith is free will.
Yeah.
Right. And it is difficult because it is the magic in the box, right? How does free will work? Well, it doesn't work if it works according to physical law. So if you can describe it by physical law, it's no longer free will. So it has to be sort of magic in some sense. And yet if you don't believe in it, you end up in a pretty miserable place pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or act as if you believe in it at the very least. Right? And that's my other complaint with people who claim not to believe in free will, is they will nonetheless give reasons why they do things and why you should not do things. Right? If you poke them with a sharp stick repeatedly, they'll be like, stop doing that, as if you can, right? They don't act in accordance with their belief, or their stated belief, right? And I mean, it would be hilarious to be like, look, I can't, there's no free will, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I have to. This is just the way the universe played out. That's just,
can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's just the way the physics is, right?
One of the, I don't know if you had finished with this train of thought.
Yeah, I think that was it.
One of the very insightful and interesting concepts that he brought up in the first video, and I told you about this months ago, is the idea of psychotechnologies. I think this was an incredibly useful thing.
Yeah, let's get there, because I actually want to... I do think that his historical account, and I'll be more brief, hopefully, than he was, I think is very useful, right? Talking about how we underwent a near-extinction event, and that forced sort of a joint movement to coast to coastal regions and increase trade to sort of make up for deficiencies, right? Which meant that we started interacting with strangers much more than is common in the animal kingdom at large, right? The frequency of interfacing with strangers went up, right? And that led to an increased need for the idea of understanding the emotional states of others. And being ethical, as we talked about, he didn't mention that, but I would add that, is building reputation, right? And then also reading and understanding where someone else is coming from. What do you need out of this interaction? I need to be able to kind of get in your head. And that means I need to be able to step out of my own head, right? Which is a unique sort of ability. And the more, again, there's a survival advantage. The better I am at that, the better I'm going to be able to trade, and the more successful I and my tribe will be. But then, yeah, it becomes somewhat reciprocal as well. If we're trading and even if I'm successful at being so much of a killer trader that your tribe dies out, well, I may actually have kind of shot myself in the foot if you had access to things that I can't get, right? So the idea of well, it's not now that social species kind of thing becomes really prominent, where actually it may be best if we all do well, even at the cost of me doing maximally well, right? So getting a greater sense of time and the continuity of myself over time, right? Is that the future me is me, and I'm going to step out of time and project that into the future, right? And he talked about developing projectile weapons as developing a better sense of time and space and continuity. I also thought it was fascinating. He's like, well, if you develop the ability to understand the emotional states of others, you inherently develop a better ability to understand your own emotional states, right? Those two go hand in hand. You start to you become more self-aware, right? Mm-hmm. And so you may not need any updated brain hardware. That may be pure software in terms of how it's used, right? And then the idea of, and this gets a little bit back into what we were talking about before, but if I'm interfacing with strangers, then I need to prove my loyalty to the community, to the group. And that means that there are these rituals where we undergo intense pain and fear in order to prove loyalty, right? To prove commitment to the group. But in order to get through that, it means that I have to develop the ability to regulate my emotions. So I can't it's not enough to become aware of them. Mm-hmm. I actually have to develop control over them in order to get through these rituals of belonging now, right? So we start to adapt these societies of people that are able to be empathetic, regulate their own emotions, and demonstrate future thinking, both in terms of commitment to my own group and commitment to promises that I've made about the future and who I will be in the future, right? So that, I think, was a fascinating section on how we developed into these creatures who have these abilities, but also these tendencies to say, well, okay, we need to be more, that being more ethical is the survival strategy, right? And there is something in the idea of meaning, and he hasn't gotten to this, but what it made me think of was you can't have a sense of meaning if you're not the same person one moment to the next. There has to be a thread of continuity of your identity. Because by the time you get where you're going, it better be the same you. Right? Or the suffering of the current. We talked about getting through difficulty, getting over difficulty, pursuing meaning. Well, if the person who arrives is not the person who's going through the difficulty, why would I do that? Right? So that thread of self self-identity, I think, becomes an important precursor to meaning. I don't know if that bubbles anything up for you.
Well, so when he describes the psychotechnologies, and it could be that trade is a kind of stimulus or for self-growth, and it could be a psychotechnology unto itself as well, right? Because it, brings up a whole host of behaviors that wouldn't otherwise have arisen. But his explanation of what a psychotechnology is specifically related to numeracy and literacy, specifically, I think he mentioned this later on.
Yeah, he gave that as an example, yeah.
Oh, well, I think he gets into it in a lot more detail later on, alphabetic literacy specifically, right? So
yep.
you would have hieroglyphics, and that's the only way you would be able to store information. And then when you get alphabetic literacy, there's suddenly an explosion in availability of literacy, because it's actually now much easier to be able to store ideas down in physical form, refer to them later, move ideas forward in time. And more importantly, once you have the concept of you have a vocabulary that can expand, you have increasing levels of abstractions that literacy provides, and numeracy also forces that as well to some extent, then those tools in turn can be turned inward for self-evaluation and examination and transformation as well. So whether that all came about because of, the whatever destruction occurred amongst humans that, precipitated those changes, or whether it would have occurred anyway, I don't really know. But when it did come to the scene...
Yeah, but we have... I am perpetually fascinated for this exact reason with Helen Keller's autobiography. Because born, or suffered an illness, blind, deaf, and dumb, right? And then encountered a teacher who... And she was old enough to remember the moment that her brain made the connection between the sign that was being signed into her hand and the experience of wetness and water. And that one was a symbol for the other. She actually remembers that moment, right? Which is a fascinating idea, because obviously we all did that as infants before we really remember, right? That connection was made. And yeah, her description is quite moving of how that affected her, that she ran around touching things and then holding her hand out because an entire world opened up that had not, the ability to communicate symbolically, right, had not been there. So she sort of re-derived this technology, and we have actually an account of what that does to your mind, right? And I believe I'm misquoting this, but it's something like, she described that as something like the moment she became human. Like there was some reference to her humanity there, that it was such a profound explosion in her mind of symbological reference, right? And one can only imagine that then taking that, and of course then she learned, writing in Braille and all those other things, because once the symbology thing is in your head, then you can move to, actually there's all these other symbologies, right? And ways of representing not just signing and touch, but actually touch on paper, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a huge leap that we take for granted. That how big of an explosion exists when we can represent things in easily accessible symbols.
Yeah, and then for Helen Keller, it went from 0 to 1, right? Whereas people who, already have access to speech and words, language, when they go from just that alone in the vocal form to that being in a written form, I would say that that's a step order function, enhancement of that technology, right? And
because then, vocal you can only learn from people you have direct interaction with,
Yeah.
Right? If they're dead, you can't learn from them vocally.
But I think, more than just the ability to store others' information or even your information forward in time is the ability to manipulate those abstractions in your mind with greater efficiency. I think that's where the bulk of the transformation occurred. Not so much that, you invented literacy. You invented literacy and then now you're reading someone's novel and that's enriching your life, right? That comes much later. But the idea that, there are these things called words and you can learn more complicated abstractions as a result of that. Because, how many times have you...
I hadn't thought of it.
How many times have you wanted to explore a complicated idea and you started just writing it down because you lay it out in front of you so you can see it in its entirety? And so that's an advanced example of how you can process abstractions in a highly complex way. But even if it's less complex, even if you just start understanding that you can manipulate these abstractions in your mind in ever complicated ways, there's such a thing as prose, there's such a thing as, a long argument, right? So if you have literacy, you also have access to the ability to be able to comport a long philosophical argument as well. And that's definitely if a numeracy and the ability to, or the necessity to keep accounts accurately, right, in terms of trade. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons he also posits that numeracy became ascendant as well, as now we have to start counting and keeping track of things that we're trading. So you combine that with literacy, Vedic literacy as well, and those two psychotechnologies in turn become transformative psychotechnologies for inner transformation as well.
So again, there are. So the book Range by Epstein talks about the Flynn effect, which I mentioned earlier, that people are getting smarter over time, right? And it gives the example that there were post-World War II, like pre-industrialization, some remaining villages, and people had gone there to sort of talk to the inhabitants. And it was unusual how different they were than even their children who were in school and kind of learning in more modern ways, because their capacity for abstraction was so much lower, right? So things like, well, can you organize all of these, there's these like skeins of wool, right? Rolls that say, okay, well, sort them by color, right? And kind of going back to our previous discussion about arbitrary lines, they weren't able to do it because if the shade was slightly different, it went in its own pile, right? So they didn't have the notion that, like, well, reds can be grouped together. It was like, well, this is a different color. So it was all piles of one, right? They said, well, if all bears in the north are white, if you go north, what color, and you see a bear, what color would it be? They would say, I haven't been north. I can't speak to that, right? It was so much more of a concrete framing. The idea of hypotheticals and the idea of axioms and derivation was not there, even though they had verbal language. I mean, they had functioning verbal and even written language, right? There is some progressive abstraction that we have been undergoing, even fairly recently. So I wonder how about, and I have, again, this is, I think, probably in a later lecture, but I'm wondering about the timeline he's talking about here, because I think you can find examples of farming villages even as late as the 1940s where this type of reasoning was not present, right? And I don't know if that was because I don't know if they were literate or not, actually. I should say that. But I know the language, there was a written form of the language. I don't know whether the people were literate.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what time frame. I want to say we're talking about something like 11,000 years ago, but don't quote me on that. It's I think the end of the Ice Age. Sorry, the Iron Age. That were the beginning of the. Again, don't quote me. I'm not entirely sure what the time frame.
It'd just be interesting because, I mean, you and I know so many people in the third world are still illiterate, right? And so you wonder about their, what is the capacity for abstraction there? Is it different? What is that mind like? Right?
IQ tests at the end of the day are probably only measuring our ability to manipulate complex abstractions, right? And so if you are exposed to complex abstractions, starting off with the reading and writing, as you get older, you have access to ever more complicated abstractions, and that gets reflected in IQ tests, 100%. Right? And so in as much as literacy allowed for self-examination using those tools, it ended up becoming a transformative tool for inner transformation as well. And I think that's kind of the point that he was making. It is something that never occurred to me before, that you could have a abstraction tool like literacy that's what that is, right? And that tool can fundamentally change your cognitive capabilities in very profound ways. It was a completely new idea for me. I was really seized by it for a while. And I started thinking, what other kind of psychotechnologies are out there that, may have not yet been invented yet, that may allow human consciousness to sort of get to some other kind of a level of inner transformation or just elevation. I mean, definitely literacy and numeracy are huge, but does it just end there? Is there something else on the pipeline at some point that will allow us to enhance ourselves even further? So it was a really great concept. I mean, I remember telling you about it months ago.
Yeah, I agree. It is a great abstraction. It's a great way of conceiving of that process. And that gets into sort of the notion of these shamanistic rituals, right? Is, using certain rituals, psychedelics, among other methods, right? So chanting, sleep deprivation, rhythmic dance, drums, social isolation, starvation, fasting, all the things that are just even Native American spirit journeys, that I've read accounts of, like, incorporate some of these elements, right? And are using them as ritualistic tools to enhance. It's a psychotechnology, right? It is enhancing your cognition, your brain's ability to find new pathways, right? To break out of its current set of established pathways and form new ones in ways that allow you to get, I love his terminology, to gain insight. Right? And so I think that idea of having rituals of how to break out of the box when needed, right? To say, hey, if we're struggling as a people, then the shaman will undergo a ritual to break out of his box and sort of take that risk of experiencing that difficult experience in order to form new connections and come back and tell us what we should do, right? And then maybe each individual needs to do that at least once in their lifetime, right? It's not necessarily something that has to happen every day, but once in your lifetime, you probably need to undergo a journey where you reformulate your mind so that your brain gets the idea of reformulation even, right?
Yeah, that different states of consciousness are even possible, right? Because there's many people who just, this is all there is, right? There's no other way to be, no other way to actually see, so. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to, going through the rest of these, with you. The first lecture is definitely just sort of setting the foundation. He really gets into the nitty gritty in the following lectures.
There was one last item that I wanted to, is in these rituals, he talks about, and it ties a couple things together. One, these are rituals of experience, not belief, right? It is something that is undergone. It's something that is done and experienced that then breaks you out of the mold of your previous ways of being and thinking. He talked about how they would imitate animals but it wasn't trying to think like an animal. It was trying to be that animal, to embody that animal, right? To really move like that animal and feel and experience and eat like that, to get into its skin and understand what it was doing, right? And again, it's that feeling what it is like to be that animal, not having beliefs about the animal, right? Mm. The reason I brought that up is that I think that Jung understood this. He's talked about the shadow and engaging with the shadow and the collective unconscious as, and I think modern therapy has sort of lost its way, even though in the movies, therapists are shown as shamans, as people who will guide you to a new way of being, right? My experience of therapy has not been that. Mm. The times where I've been in therapy, it has been a fairly empty experience of somebody sort of nodding along as I tell them whatever. And part of the issue there, as Jung pointed out, is that it is not a sterile experience. You have to get in the dirt and actually embody these things and act it out. It has to be visceral. It cannot be purely cognitive, right? Mm. And that's why these rituals are not, you have to do things. You have to be sleep deprived or isolated or whatever. Like it's not going to be handed to you if you want to break out of your current way of being into a new way. It's not going to be something you can think your way into. Your current thought pattern is the issue, right? So you're not going to use your current thought pattern to get to a new thought pattern, right? There has to be a breaking. And I think that's why he uses these images of awakening. Moving from sleep into wakefulness. I don't know. There is that breaking of the dream. There's something rebirth. There is something different as you move from sleep to wakefulness. That's deeper than just a different way of thinking. It's not an updating of a belief. It's something more than that.
Yeah, I think that's well said. It also sort of highlights the idea that there are truths that can be described, on pen and paper, using the psychotechnology of literacy, and then there's truths that are just known, right? That you just experience, and it's challenging to.
No, I'll take it. I'll take that one step further. So there's a Matrix quote, right? But if you remember when he meets the Oracle, right, and he knocks over the vase, right, and she says, "Well, what's really going to get you later on is would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything?" Right? And where I'm going with that is there's another quote, I believe by Voltaire, which is "Some things must be believed to be seen." And I've always loved that quote, is we have this empiric idea that, well, I'll believe it when I see it. Right? And that for many things, especially in this space, sorry to fly here, especially in this space, is backwards. Is this free will thing. Like, all of this is, well, if you believe that, you can see all these things. And if you don't believe it, you will not be able to see that there is any meaning in life. You will not. All of these things we're talking about require you to first take that leap of faith and believe first. And I think that, again, there's that throwback to the religious notion that we've become so scornful of blind belief. And yet we need at least one, to get the whole thing started.
Yeah. No, for me, that idea was a little bit of a perspective shift from my whole, empirical atheist, perspective, which is that, if you can't, give me the answer in a document, right, with words and an argument and math and philosophy or whatever, then it's not a truth at all. Then it's just a blind belief, and blind beliefs can never be truths, right? And that's the empirical view. And so that has changed. It makes sense now in retrospect that just is a very silly way of looking at the world, because our ability to cognate on any particular issue like meaning or purpose is very limited, right? These abstractions only get us so far. There are truths out there that have to be experienced, right? And you can't philosophize your way into loving somebody, for example. Right, that's a cheap way of making that point.
Yeah, totally.
So the same is the case for things like meaning and purpose, and having sort of that sense of meaning and purpose imbued in your life those are experiential truths. They're not philosophical truths.
Yeah.